Hello, welcome everyone to this first inaugural lecture on the course titled Introduction to Multimodal Urban Transportation Systems. Here in this course, you will be exposed to various types of urban transportation modes, how do you plan for them and how do you integrate them. So, this first week we would give you an introduction of the overall urban transportation system, and in this first lecture let us see what we have lined up for you. So, in the first lecture we will look at urbanization and its relationship to transportation, right. We will cover the urbanization rates and how the urbanization is impacting the economy, and as a result of that how are the travel demands of the citizens living in these urban areas increasing, how is the urban areas dealing with poverty, and in turn how is transportation helping in alleviating poverty or reducing poverty, and then we will start looking at the rate at which motorization is happening in India as a result of urbanization, increase in purchase power, etc. So, when you start looking at transportation, invariably you are thinking about all the transportation modes in the cities, in the urban areas, right. They may be small cities, mega cities, metropolises, but urbanization and transportation go very much hand in hand. You may know that India was at the time of independence called a nation of villages, right. Lots of multiple small villages that used to constitute a majority of the Indian geography, and most of the people used to be living in rural areas, but that has not been so since the last 2 or 3 decades, where a lot of people have now either shifted to the urban areas, or also the other contributing factor has been the rise in population, right. So, the rise in population coupled with migration from the rural areas to the urban areas has led to a lot of people now living in the urban areas. Statistics show that 77% of the global urban population is expected to be in the developing countries. So, India being one of the developing nations in the world, it is in such nations that you see a higher percentage of people living in urban areas. As a result of this population growth, what we are also seeing is that this population now in the urban areas are again sprawling. So, what is happening is the people that have moved or the people that are newly born in these urban areas are now looking to kind of move away from the urban areas, but not too far away. So, the suburban areas are being formed. So, this entire area of the urban agglomeration is increasing day by day. So, it is expected that by 2050, 50%, almost 50% of India's population would be living in the urban areas, which currently is about 32%. So, you would see, you can imagine the amount of rise in the number of people who want to live in the urban areas. As you all know, India has 4 metropolitan cities, and Delhi being the one that has the highest population of 29 million, and now it is expected to be the most populous city in the world by 2028, right. So, with such large number of people living in the urban areas, this definitely is putting a stress on the infrastructure that is available in these cities. It is also being noticed that the urban areas are driving the economy. That means, why are people migrating to these urban places or urban areas, right? Because there are jobs, because there is some form of employment which is otherwise not available in the rural areas. So, although the urban population currently is only 32% of the total population in India, but it contributes over 60% to India's GDP. So, you see the India's GDP is very much dependent upon the urban areas and the jobs that are there in the urban areas. So, this is a catch-22 kind of a situation. One you can say that why are there no jobs in the rural areas, and because of no jobs in the rural areas, people are migrating to the urban areas. However, the urban areas are getting too congested, and then people are again sprawling out to the suburban areas, which are almost the urban periphery. So, there is kind of a two-way dynamics going on here. It might turn into a vicious cycle if we don't arrest this situation pretty quickly. This is what I was talking about when I was talking about the sprawl in the suburban areas. From just 35 in 2001, the number of metropolitan areas has grown to above more than 50. And what we are also seeing is that cities with population of more than 5 million are now there are 8 cities. So, in addition to the 4 mega cities or the metropolitan areas, we are also seeing the rise of the cities such as Hyderabad, Bangalore, Ahmedabad and Pune. So, all of these areas are attracting people because of the employment opportunities there, and everybody seems to be moving into these cities. So, as a result of this, what is happening to the transportation network of these cities, right? So, back in the day when the cities were small in size, the population was not that much, the planning of the city was done in such a way to cater to the population at that period. However, with this great influx of people or the increase in the population and population density in the urban areas, what is happening is the existing transportation network is under great stress, right. Stress meaning it is not able to provide for the mobility or accessibility of the people residing there. So, for example, you every day hear that all the roads in the nation's large cities are congested. The time it takes to travel 2 kilometers is often in the morning peak hour is often more than 30 minutes in such along such roads in certain cities, and that adds to a lot of not only a travel time delay, but also it leads to a lot of pollution in these urban areas. So, what is happening is as people start living in these cities and the road network is not able to cater to their needs, there is an always increasing requirement of building new roads. However, building new roads are also not solving the problem, they are only shifting the problem by 5 or 10 years maybe, and after 5 or 10 years we are back to a situation where congestion returns. So, people are then looking for alternative means of improving the mobility or accessibility in these urban areas. So, as we look at different means such as metro rail, BRTS, now you have public bicycle sharing systems in India, the sidewalk or the pedestrian transport network is being looked at very carefully, so that not many people should be willing to take motorized trips when they can take non-motorized trips such as walking or bicycling. So, all of these now different forms of urban transportation modes are being implemented in these urban areas. However, the other issue with that is with all these modes coming in, the next step is to integrate them into the system, right. If you have a bus network that is not integrated with the metro rail network, which is not integrated with the parking system, so it becomes a chaos. So, what we are currently experiencing in India is the evolution of the transportation system or the transportation network in the urban areas, and this is what I just talked about is only looking at the transportation system for the people, right. Along with it, there is the transportation system for the freight, right. That is a very very important part of the urban transportation system. If you do not get the goods in time, you may not be able to cater to every family's needs who require fresh vegetables, who require fresh milk. So, all of this has to be transported on some vehicle or the other, and it has to reach to the destinations on time. So, urban transportation plays a big role in the economy of the nation, and if the transportation system is smooth, if it provides good quality of service, then the economy invariably improves. So, that is how on a very broad scale, if anybody asks you how transportation affects the economy or how urban transportation impacts the economy, you can explain it in that manner. With this increase in the mobility needs of the people living in the urban areas, we are seeing different types of issues as well, right. Urban transportation infrastructure, although is the skeleton of the urban form, but what is happening is our cities are old, relatively our large cities, many of our even smaller cities are old. So, the transportation infrastructure there is also old. Now, once it is aging and once due to the growth of the population, you are unable to kind of revive this old infrastructure, or it becomes very difficult to revive the old infrastructure. For example, if you have a narrow road or a bridge which you do not monitor for many years, what happens is because of the ever increasing loads that the bridges are carrying, for example, the trucks are getting larger and larger, the car sizes are increasing, and all this is putting the stress on that bridge or the road, and they are deteriorating. Once they have deteriorated, it is very difficult to repair them because of the issues in the urban areas such as narrow streets. You cannot maybe able to get to those streets. So, what is happening is people are now then moving out to the suburban areas, like I said. So, when in the suburban areas you have green field, you can develop new infrastructure and you can have better quality of infrastructure. So, in search of better quality infrastructure, people are moving out to the suburban areas. However, that is eating up on some of the farmlands that are in the periphery of the area. So, that is also not desirable. What is also happening with this suburban sprawl is that it is primarily the residential areas that are moving out to the suburban area and not the offices. So, now people are living far away from their offices, which is in turn is resulting in a situation where they have to travel longer distances, right. If you live very close to your school or very close to your office or very close to the market, then you have to travel only short distances. But now if you live in this suburban area and your office is still in the central business district, then your travel time or travel distance increases. And so, with this increase, again the same thing starts happening. You emit a lot of gases into the noxious gases into the atmosphere, which causes severe air quality issues in many of the cities. And also, we have now noticed that there is an increase, there is a correlation between the number of kilometers that you travel and the probability of an accident that you might get into. The more you travel, it seems like there are more number of accidents. So, all of this is some of the characteristics of the urban transportation system in India currently, where also, I mean, we are looking at mobility as such, but along with mobility, we are also trying to look at accessibility, and we will get into what those terminologies mean during the course of this entire lecture series, and you would be able to distinguish between all the terminologies. The other issue with urban transport is how it can help facilitate the livelihood of people, right. Transportation, you would as you start reading more and more about transportation, one thing to keep in mind is that transportation is a derived demand, right, meaning you travel from one place to the other for some purpose. You are not just traveling without any purpose. There are some leisure trips that you take, but that is also for a purpose. So, you are going on a vacation, so that is the purpose of your travel. You hardly are on the road because of nothing. So, even if you are exercising, that is a purpose, right. There are very few trips that you just want to relax and you are walking on the road alongside a park or something like that, but those types of trips are very few in nature. So, Transportation being a derived demand, you are always traveling for a purpose, and the overwhelming majority of the reasons for which you are traveling is essentially for livelihood, right. Everybody almost travels at least twice a day, once from home to work and work to home. It is all for livelihood, right. The other purposes may be for education, for health, for leisure, like I said, but the overwhelming majority of the people actually travel on the road because of livelihood. Now, this, if the transportation network that is provided in an urban area enables people to access their workplaces from their homes in a timely and a quality manner and in a safe manner, in a timely fashion, provide with quality infrastructure and in a safe manner, then we could say that the infrastructure is sufficient, or the transport infrastructure is sufficient in helping the economy or the livelihood of the people. But more and more projects that are coming in are kind of skewed towards one section of the society and not taking into account other sections of society. So, I could give you an example. For example, if you widen a road, roads are predominantly for motorized travel, right. So, suddenly if you widen a 2-lane road into a 4-lane road, which goes from the middle of your city, what happens is the pavement is taken up by vehicles, and vehicles can be owned by people who have enough money to buy those vehicles, right. And now suddenly if there are no sidewalks or there are no footpaths alongside these roads, or there is not enough buses, if a bus comes only once an hour, so what happens is the people who cannot afford vehicles are now at a disadvantage. Now, you had a 2-lane road where they could maybe cross safely. Now, the 4-lane road, the crossing of pedestrians becomes unsafe, and so the people who are accessing job locations from one side of the road to the other side of the road now feel unsafe. So, what starts happening is the vulnerable road users, or the section of the society that cannot afford to buy a vehicle, suddenly feels disadvantaged. They feel that this infrastructure, transport infrastructure that is put in place is not for me, and as a result of this, my livelihood chances or my livelihood opportunities are not improving. So, they kind of resist any kind of change. So, you see when land is required to widen such roads, many people do not feel that they should give up their land, and one of the reasons behind the thinking is if I give up my land which I was using for cultivation, now I lose my land, but by widening of the road I am not going to get sufficient remuneration which will allow me to continue my livelihood for at least my age, or at least the generation after me. So, what starts happening is these modes starts favoring only the people who can afford motorized vehicles, and the poverty does not come out. However, if you invest in public transportation modes, mass rapid transportation modes, you would see that it's even the people who cannot afford will be using such modes, and then there will be enough opportunities for them to commute between their homes and office, and they have a chance to come out of poverty, right. So, you should never be in a situation that is shown in this picture where you have one bus and the bus is so overcrowded because none of the people who are on the bus can afford a vehicle. So, everybody has to take on that bus or a truck. It seems like a truck, but this kind of situation should not arise when we are talking about urban transportation modes. So, the transportation modes should cater to all parts of the urban area, all sections of society living in the urban area, and not skewed towards only one group. As the Indian cities, right, we have already talked about this, as we grow outward, as we spread outward. So, this phenomenon is called urban sprawl. So, you see transportation is a very interesting the transportation is a very interesting subject. It is almost a blend of civil engineering, urban planning, economics, right? All of these things come together in transportation. Many people call it transportation engineering, but this form of multimodal urban transportation is just not engineering. It is much more than engineering. It has economics associated with it. It has urban planning aspects associated with it. So this phenomenon of urban sprawl is a very important phenomenon that transportation agencies guard against. Although they cannot, the transportation agencies are not currently directly involved in developing the master plans for cities, which they should be involved. And when the urban planner develops the master plan, they also keep in mind that there should be strong growth boundaries, right? So a city is planned in such a way that they have, for the next 20 years, this is the boundary along which all the growth of the city would happen, and nothing beyond it, because the minute you start sprawling beyond those boundaries, you are at a disadvantage, both in terms of transportation, in terms of environment. You kind of are at a disadvantage, because like we already discussed, travel more from suburban to the urban city core, you emit more gases, vehicle emissions increases, and it affects the environment. So you have to be very careful when you are trying to look at how sprawl impacts transportation, or vice versa, how transportation impacts sprawl. Now, when you start looking at the various modes of transport or urban transport, you would find that predominantly in the cities and towns in India, a lot of people used to walk for various purposes, because when the city was very small, very compact, your grocery store used to be very close to your home, your bank used to be very close, your markets used to be very close. So you could easily walk or access these different types of land uses. However, as the city starts to grow, what happens is, now you have specialty retail stores which you want to go to. They may be only 1 or 2 in the city, and invariably they are never close to your home. So you have to depend on motorized modes. Then you have the introduction of metro rail in multiple cities in India now. Most of the major cities have some form of bus transportation, and then there is another form of transport in the urban areas which we call intermediate public transportation system. So that is IPT. So these are the auto rickshaws or the cycle rickshaws that provide you the last mile connectivity from your bus station to your home, or from a metro station to your home. And so these are those modes collectively are called intermediate public transportation systems. Taxis are also a form of that. And now the most recent ones that have been introduced into the urban transportation networks are the transportation network companies, right? The Olas and the Ubers. Now you have on-demand public transportation systems. So many of them call them as on-demand transportation systems, because whenever you need one, you use your mobile device to hail one of these rides, and they arrive, and then you take it. So there are different forms of urban transportation modes that are available in your cities. However, the trend, if you look at this, if you look at the figure, the chart that is shown here, the trend is that there is a decrease in the number of people who want to use non-motorized transport or public transportation, and there is an increase in the number of people who want to use motorized transportation, such as either their two-wheelers or their cars, and so on and so forth. So there are multiple reasons for such things. One of the primary reasons is aspiration. You hear that India is an aspirational country. As our GDP increases, our income rises, and as our income rises, we always want to have better modes of transport which provide us much more comfort, which are available to us at any point in time. So we can take it and move from one part of the city to the other. There are externalities to it, but it is a fact that as income increases, the tendency to use motorized modes also increases. So, when we were talking about travel demand, that is what we were essentially meaning. So, you can see in this chart that currently or by 2007, the percentage of two-wheelers and cars are overwhelmingly high in most of the cities in India. They increase the length of trips, right? And it has increased the length of trips because now you are living farther and farther away from the place where you work, or the place where your school is, or the place where you go to shop, and that is increasing the number of kilometers that you travel. So, when I say vehicle kilometers of travel, that is what I mean to say. So, not only is the ownership of vehicles increasing, so not only are more and more people owning motorized vehicles, but the number of kilometers that they are using those vehicles is also increasing, right? And that is giving rise to this entire phenomenon of congestion, right. So, as I said, the transportation again is a very closely related to economics, right. So, if the supply of road is constant, right, so meaning the number of lanes that you provide remains constant. However, the demand for travel is increasing, right. Demand for travel meaning the number of vehicles on the road is increasing, and the number of kilometers driven on those vehicles is also increasing. So, what happens is there is a mismatch between the supply and the demand. The supply cannot keep pace with the increasing demand, right. You cannot widen a road every day. However, every day you are adding to the number of vehicles that are actually using this road. So, as there is an imbalance between the supply and the demand, now that gives rise to congestion. So, this congestion, when you see congested roads in your city or in urban areas, you have to keep in mind that why this is happening. This is happening due to the phenomenon of supply not keeping up or not keeping pace with the demand, with the travel demand. Here is an example or data that shows that the number of how the total number of vehicles registered have increased over years, right. So, if the red line is the total, so what you can see is the number of two-wheelers, the blue line is very similar to the growth pattern in the total number of vehicles. So, that means in India we are not buying too many cars or jeeps or four-wheelers, but the number of two-wheelers are very high. That is what even this slide is telling. Along with the increase in the number of two-wheelers, what is also happening is there is a decrease in the number of buses that are being actually put out on the urban transportation network. So, you would see many of the governments always pushing for buying new buses, because one bus can transport 40 people, whereas one two-wheeler can transport at the maximum legally 2 people, right. So, investing in a bus is much more thoughtful from the transportation point of view than saying that 40 people buy 40 individual motorcycles, right. This chart further provides figures such as personalized vehicles like cars and two-wheelers grew at a rate of 9.6% to 10.3% per annum. The basic problem is not the number of vehicles in the country, but the concentration in a very few select cities, right. This is a very concentrated phenomenon. It doesn't happen in smaller cities. They have different transportation issues, but the congestion issue is concentrated to just these large cities. It is interesting to note that nearly 35% of the total vehicles in the country are plying in metropolitan cities alone, which constitute only around 11% of the total population, vehicle population. So 35%, so 1/3 of all the vehicles are in the metropolitan areas, right. So the non-metropolitan areas, everything put together has the rest of the 67%. 5 metro cities are the ones that are looking at higher motorization rates, and what is happening is now one household has more than one motorized vehicle. So it is very common to see in any urban areas or in any urban metropolitan areas especially, that a household has either two wheelers, either has one 2-wheeler and one 4-wheeler. So you see what is happening is now 10 years or 20 years before, a family used to have one vehicle. So what it would do is, it would add, every household would add only one vehicle to the transportation system. Now suddenly within span of 10 to 20 years, every household is adding at least 2 vehicles to the transportation system. So the number of vehicles added per household has doubled. So you can imagine what stress or what impact it is having on the congestion along the streets. Definitely the number of lanes has not doubled, right. So this is the impact that motorization is having in our large cities, as well as in the cities that are increasingly seeing more population living in them, such as Hyderabad and Bangalore and so on and so forth. So that concludes our first lecture in this course. We looked at urbanization and the urbanization rates, which contribute to not only GDP increase, but also contributes to sprawl, and is also in turn contributing to the transportation networks, sometimes failures, sometimes inability to cope. So how are we looking at urbanization and transport? We gave you some examples of some cities, and in the next lecture we will in depth now look at the transportation system in itself. Thank you very much.